Hello everyone. When I wrote this episode, it was the day after the Trans Pride March in London. I would have loved to have attended. Unfortunately, I had this thing called work getting in the way. Now, Pride Marches have always been at their heart a protest, but this year's Pride took that to heart in a way that hasn't been seen for many years. Have a look at my videos on the Gender Recognition Act reforms to see why. Now, if there was one driving force behind why many trans people have been forced to protest to defend our rights, it is without a shadow of a doubt the gender critical movement. This is actually the third time I've tried to write this video. I simply couldn't do it and keep it under 20 minutes, so I've decided to split it into 3 videos, each covering a different aspect of the movement's arguments. Most of the arguments used against trans people echo those that have been used against almost every other minority for years. The homophobic language seen in the gay liberation of the 70s and the 80s, and the racist language that was used against the civil rights groups in the 50s and the 60s. This video will be about what I've previously called their calling card, SingleSex Spaces. But before I get to that, I probably should explain who the gender critical movement are. The gender critical movement sprang out of the feminist movement, when some people began to fear that giving trans people, and specifically trans women. Can I just say, trans men exist too. There's about an equal number of trans men and women, but for some reason, it's trans women that attract almost all of the criticism. I don't want anyone to think that I'm ignoring trans men. I'm not. It's just when you talk about these arguments, they're almost always directed at trans women. So when I have to address these arguments, I have to talk about trans women. Anyway, they feared equal rights would infringe on their own hard-won rights. I have never understood that fear. Trans people having equal rights to everyone else doesn't mean that anyone else has less rights. In Iceland, a country whose human rights are considered world-leading, the fight for women's rights and trans rights went hand in hand, working together to get a fairer future for everyone. Why this isn't the case in every country perplexes me. The term TERF, or trans exclusionary radical feminist, came about in 2008 as a way to distinguish between those feminists who accepted trans women as women and those who did not. It later took on a connotation of being insulting. Though I personally don't see any difference with another term such as racism. If you don't want to be labelled a TERF, don't act like one. Later on, those who were vocally questioning the rights of trans people began to use the phrase gender critical. And because I'm not looking to antagonise anyone, I'll be using that terminology too. SingleSex Spaces. There are several arguments the gender critical movement use, but this one really is their calling card. It's the point they're most frequently verbal about, and just hearing that phrase being used rings alarm bells for many trans people. They pose that allowing trans people, mainly trans women, into single-sex spaces poses a risk for cis women. This either explicitly or implicitly implies that trans women are a threat. They also argue that allowing trans people to self-identify will exacerbate this threat even further. This whole argument was tied in with the idea of the so-called bathroom predator, a predatory trans person or trans impersonator lurking in the toilets waiting to pounce on an unsuspecting cis woman. This originated with a billboard ad campaign, while authorities in Dallas looked to bring in a bathroom bill, and was expanded upon when North Carolina looked to do the same in 2016. Yet for all the effort these groups have put into protracting these myths, there's never been any accounts of such an attack taking place. Not in the 5 years since Ireland has had self-identification, the 10 years the UK has had equal access thanks to the Equality Act, or anywhere else that has had equal access ever. In the same time frame, it's not hard to find accounts of trans people being confronted and attacked for their use of toilets that align with their gender. In June this year, a Canadian trans woman was attacked by two cis women who called in their male friend to help them attack her. Fortunately, after intimidating her, he decided to leave without actually attacking her. The truth is, there is no one waiting for the UK to introduce self-ID before attacking someone. If there was, they'd be waiting a long time. I know I have been. The idea that someone would dress up to pretend to be trans to gain access to such a space is quite frankly ludicrous. A study from Sexuality Research and Social Policy Journal compared US local authorities with gender-inclusive public accommodations to those without any. They could not find any difference in frequency, and the study concluded, and I'm quoting, "Fears of increased safety and privacy violations as a result of non-discrimination laws are not empirically grounded." So where does this idea come from? For most of these people, it simply comes down to the fact that a lot of people don't accept trans women as women. For others, it may be the image from several Hollywood films, from Hitchcock's Psycho to Michael Caine's role in Dressed to Kill, through to Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Even though these films acknowledge these characters are not transgender, the image still persists. This is why J.K. Rowling's latest book has caused such outrage. It's a really harmful trope that people who argue against equal rights for trans people use time and time again. I highly recommend you watch Disclosure on Netflix, as it takes a really good look at this issue and is well worth a watch anyway. In the fallout from the leaked GRA report, we have seen that the single-sex spaces targeted the most are public toilets and shelters for women. Either homeless shelters or shelters for women who have been the victims of rape or abuse. Trans women need these services too. A report released by Stonewall in 2018 highlighted how vulnerable trans women are to domestic abuse. During 2017, 7.5% of women reported having had experience of domestic abuse. But during the same time, 16% of trans women experienced abuse from a partner. These women have nowhere else to go. A report in America showed that trans people were twice as likely to be unemployed and 4 times as likely to be living below the poverty line. A report from the UK showed how hard it can be to get a job if you're trans. A survey in 2018 showed 1 in 3 employers were less likely to hire someone that was trans, and 74% of employers had never knowingly worked with a transgender person. Nearly a third of transgender and non-binary people experience homelessness in their lifetimes. Denying these services to people who so clearly need it is callous and cruel. What's more is that the UK government has seemingly taken action over some of the negative responses to the consultation. Some responses expressed a fear that self-identification would allow male abusers to access shelters, and it was these responses Liz Truss seemed to be on the verge of acting upon in July. In May 2019, the Women's and Equality Select Committee held a public hearing to address these concerns. MPs questioned experts, and though some of them expressed fears, one of them fittingly enough was called Karen, it was clear that there was no evidence to support any of the claims. When Diana James from Cornwall Refuge Trust was asked if a cisgender man could pretend to be transgender to gain access to shelters, she said outright that it was impossible, and laid out the screening processes that would inhibit such a thing from occurring. The truth is, there is no evidence supporting the myth that granting trans people access to single-sex spaces poses any additional risk to anyone. In an article in Trauma, Violence and Abuse academic journal, it was said, notably absent from the evidence base are any data supporting the idea, widely espoused in public opinion around bathroom bills and other legislation affecting LGBTQ people, that sexual or gender minorities might pose a threat to the safety of those in the sexual or gender majority. Instead, this wide body of research indicates that sexual and gender minorities are themselves at elevated risk for physical and sexual assault. Trans people are twice as likely to be the victims of crime as cis people. Denying them access to such spaces would only heighten that risk further. The majority of people support trans people's access to these spaces. A recent survey by YouGov showed that 57% of cis women supported self-identification, while only 21% opposed it. A study by ONS showed similar numbers last year. Out of the 100,000 responses to consultation, 70% were positive. In May 2019, Hampstead Heath swimming ponds held a vote on whether trans women could access the women's only pond. 65% voted in favour. Again and again we see similar percentages, yet the UK government seems set to claim the results of the consultation were skewed by trans rights groups and their supporters. We should hear their official response any day now. The gender critical movement are trying to play to people's fears. They look to court controversy in order to gain attention. J.K. Rowling surely knew that having a cis man dress up as a woman in order to kill women would upset a lot of people, yet she pushed ahead anyway, and shock horror, we are seeing people rush to her defense. They paint trans people as aggressors and a threat to the safety of women to get people's sympathies. Some people who have left the movement have compared their experience within it to being in a cult or to being radicalized. The movement is twisting the concerns and fears a lot of people have to spread the hate they feel. The lies they tell don't hold up to the slightest scrutiny, and there's nothing to back up their arguments. This is why it's really concerning when you hear someone in a position of authority such as Liz Truss repeating their words. Fortunately, we can see from the polls the majority of people see through this ploy. Time and again, I've seen people restore my faith in humanity and remind me that this is coming from a minority. This is a video I didn't really want to make, but I think it's important to show their lies for what they are. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. If I've earned it, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a like, and if you shared it with your friends. Please consider subscribing too. In the next part of this mini-series, I'll be looking at how the gender critical movement claimed trans women threaten the rights of cis women and lesbians. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, goodbye.